Already today in several venues, you've heard about how Sustainable DC is really building momentum and moving forward. That the DC government is committing our money, $7 million in capital funds to date, our legislation, our regulations, our agency performance, our agency directors have performance measures that are tied to the milestones in the plan, and a lot of staff effort to make the plan a reality. But as you know, for many of the actions in the plan, we really depend on others to make these things happen, especially many of you in the private sector, builders, developers, contractors, small businesses, large businesses. And it's your innovation and leadership in the green building sector that's helped to make us a national and international leader. I tell the story all the time about our 2006 Green Building Act and how we negotiated for months and months over language that would allow the district government to be the market maker. The district would go first for several months, for years, before the private sector needed to comply, so that any cost differential could be borne by the district government. But our private sector didn't wait 1 second after that green building law was passed. And by the time they were technically required to comply in 2012, they had brought green buildings from 9 LEED certified buildings in 2006 to more than 300 in 2012 before they were technically required to comply. And they weren't delivering LEED certified buildings. They were, more than half of the buildings were gold and platinum, well beyond what was required. That's the kind of private sector we have in the District of Columbia. Give yourselves a hand. Okay, so we need you. All right, we love you. We want to encourage your efforts in this arena, and you're going to hear from one of my favorite people on the planet about how he does it. Many of you may not know that I was not always the planning director. It's been a long time, I know, but I was once a civil engineer working for the Environmental Protection Agency and thinking about how I was kind of swabbing the deck of the Titanic to be worrying about tiny amounts of pollution coming out of smokestacks and not paying any attention to land use, when land use was changing everything. So it was around 1993, which is a long time ago, 2 decades ago. I went to some crazy meeting that the Urban Land Institute hosted in Chicago to talk about something called green development. You know, it was like, what does it mean? Is there moss on it? What is green development? And I met some amazing people, many of whom I'm privileged to still consider colleagues today. And one of those transformative people was Jonathan Rose at that meeting. And so it really changed my thinking about what might be possible in terms of development and development patterns. And honest to God, I would not be here today. I wouldn't be in this city in this job if not for that meeting and meeting some of those amazing people, including Jonathan. So no pressure, Jonathan. I expect you to effect the same transformation on everyone in the room. So, you know, he's one of those people that really does well by doing good, and I admire him greatly. He's dedicated his whole career to integrating positive economic, environmental, and social outcomes, which is very hard to do. He founded Jonathan Rose Companies in 1989, which is a multidisciplinary real estate investment, development, planning, and consulting firm, but he's really been known also as a leading green urban solution provider. I remember a building that he did in Denver, the Denver Dry Goods building, where I think he took out 15 different kinds of mortgages to get that building financed. I mean, you know, I thought he was insane. But he does some of these things to show that it can be done, and every time something like that seems impossible does happen, it makes it that much easier for the next person to come along and then do it with only 10 mortgages, and soon only 7 mortgages, and after a while it just becomes like almost any other project. So he's been in that groundbreaking mold, you know, for as long as I've known him, and also a leader in establishing real estate impact investing. In 2005, he created the nation's first private equity real estate fund dedicated to delivering these social, economic, and environmental returns. And he's developed partnerships with high net worth investors, family offices and institutions, including Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and others. And finally, he's the vice chair of Enterprise Community Partners and a trustee of the National Resources Defense Council, and it kind of is an all-around amazing guy. So with that, let me introduce you to my good friend, Jonathan Rose.
Thank you. Thank you. So actually, I want to tell you the next phase of the story, which is that Harriet then called a bunch of us to a basement office at the EPA and said, all right, land use really matters. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to create a movement about it? And in that room, the smart growth movement was born, and it was named. And we talked all morning about what it should be, and then we had lunch, and then the early afternoon was, what do we name the movement? And this name, Smart Growth, kept emerging, and I had some other name. I can't remember what the name was, and I didn't vote for Smart Growth. And it shows how wrong I was. I can't remember the name I had, but anyway, that was really, Harriet pulled together this group, and then the EPA held the first Smart Growth conference, and together with ULI kicked off the promotion of a very, very important and what has become essential and compelling concept. So before I begin my talk, I flew down here today on the shuttle, and seated next to me in 19B was an airplane pilot. And the guy said to me, why are you going down? I don't talk to people on airplanes. It's a great time for me to work. And so I pretend to be working. He goes, what are you going down there for? I go, I'm giving a speech. He goes, what's your joke? And I said, what do you mean, what's my joke? And he said, well, don't you know you're supposed to start every speech with a joke? Now, I've given lots and lots of speeches. I've never started them with a joke before. So, and I remembered, somewhere like in back speech, 101, doesn't it say you're supposed to start a speech with a joke? So I got off the plane and I quickly Googled green jokes. And it turns out they're pretty bad. But I thought I'd read you what I thought was the best of the worst, just because I was supposed to start with a joke. Okay, so, question. How bad was the BP Gulf oil spill? Answer, so bad they had to start drilling for water. Okay, I'll read you one more and then we'll get on to the real talk. See if I can find it. How does President Bush plan to fight record high temperatures? By switching from Fahrenheit to Celsius. They're all old jokes because, old. All right. So this is the larger Atlantic coast region that Washington is part of. And you'll see it's really an extraordinary ecology. I mean, there's enormous amount of nature here. And what's so interesting about regions like this is the littoral zone, which is the place where the uplands meet the oceans. It's really the most fertile. So here we are coming into Washington. You can see the Beltway around, and you can see the road transportation network. And now you see all the gray that really begins to show us where the development is. And here's the city itself. So highly developed, very, very dense. In some ways uniformly dense because of the uniform height has kind of squished its density to evened it out throughout the region. So I just thought we should set the context a little bit, because also when you look in the city, what you see is a lot of gray, and you don't see that much green. And I understand there are all kinds of federal and city issues related to what the land you control and don't control. There's a tremendous boom of market rate housing happening in the city. Now, actually, this is one of the most fertile market rate development multifamily areas in the country. And the multifamily is getting very sophisticated, and actually there's a very interesting quality to it, which is as much as we've shifted as a culture. You're really seeing this exemplified in DC from a place where we are focused on the unit. The units are great, but more where we're focused on the common areas. So you're seeing tremendous green roof gardens and common barbecue areas and courtyards and amenity packages. And this sense that actually the demand has shifted from the me to the we, from the self to be part of something larger, is very, very is actually both a generational thing, but a very important part of the market. The Urban Land Institute did a study some time ago called the Beltway Burden, and so this is housing costs in the Washington metro area, and the deeper the blue, the higher the housing costs. So you can see generally as you get away from the city, housing costs go down, and what this caused was something called driving to qualify. So lower income people, working people, tended to live farther and farther away from the city where land costs and housing costs were lower. But here is the map of the transportation costs. So what happens is the low-cost housing areas were the high-cost transportation areas. So it turns out that people didn't get very far economically by actually going to these low-cost areas. And one of the interesting things is the housing crash, whole decline of 2007, 8, 9 actually started in June. The whole house of cards fell apart in June, and that's when gas hit $4 a gallon. And so the people living in these communities all of a sudden had mortgages that they could not afford, and they had a lifestyle that they could not afford. So one of the interesting things, so here's what we see, is you see the combined housing and transportation cost, and it actually goes up the farther you commute away when you combine the two, not down. And so what really happened after 2007 is an incredible reset, where number one, the fake money, the Wall Street money that was funding exurban sprawl went away with the whole subprime crisis. And this kind of authentic demand to actually be in walkable urban places, to be part of a larger thriving community, and actually both two ends of the demography, which is the baby boom generation, the older baby boom generation, and younger working people, both wanting to be in walkable, diverse cities, wanting to be in mixed income communities. So the market is now completely in alignment with the smart growth goals that we were talking about 20 years ago. The key then for a city, so if that's where the market wants to be, and that's where actually, as Harriet mentioned earlier, the private sector is so eager to work with the public sector together on, then the question is, where are we going and how are we going to get there? This is an image that is widely used in Portland, and is there one for Washington? I wasn't able to find one. So this is an image in which they got a lot of people together and said, what is our common view? So first of all, for Portland, the building that you see in the center is a green building symbolized by having windmills on the roof, which actually is a lousy idea. They don't work very well, but anyway, it's a symbol for it. And for Portland, that's a higher density building because typically people are building lower-rise buildings. You see mass transit, you see a bus, you see a light rail, but you also see cars, biking, people walking. You see local farmers selling food on the street. So you see some green space, you see street trees. So in this one image, they captured the kind of sense of where they wanted the city to go. And if you don't have such an image, I think it's a really helpful thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do because there's such a diversity of views and populations and incomes and needs. It may need to be a range of images. But I think this really helps set a positive tone if you want to create a sustainable city. The other thing that's very important is to measure where you're going. And I was really pleased to see in your sustainability report such clear goals for what you want to achieve by 2032 in terms of, for example, zero waste, 100% recycling of waste, which currently no city in America does, and reduction of water, increase of parkland, et cetera. The environmental goals, so although my core belief is that for healthy cities, we need to combine human well-being and natural systems well-being. They're deeply interlinked. And what we need to find is a language and a way to understand how those two fit together, but we also need a way to measure it. So there's been a lot of work now in measuring well-being of systems. So this is an area, this is actually came out of Alberta, Canada, and it breaks well-being into what they call genuine wealth. They're genuine wealth indicators, and they talk about personal wealth. And personal wealth in this chart, it's hard to read, but is not only about is about health and happiness and spirituality and emotional well-being, financial wealth, income. By the way, if you are poor, you cannot achieve any of these other things. It is extremely hard to be healthy when you're poor. It's extremely hard to be happy. Poor children live under enormous stress, which leads to a whole series of cognitive disabilities. And so income, having the Green Plan lead to better income opportunities for the residents of Washington is absolutely critical. It has to be tied to job and living standards. Then, as I mentioned, the personal wealth, the professional wealth, education, skills, knowledge, social wealth. So one of the things we know is how important social networks are to the health, people's psychological health, people's happiness, but also, so I co-founded something called the Garrison Institute. I'll talk a little bit about it later. We do a lot of work on behavior. And one of the things we learned is that pro-environmental behavior is a subset of pro-social behavior. And that when you link the two, so if you have pro-environmental strategies that you'd like to see implemented, when you make them social, so for example, when an Urban Land Institute or the USGBC or an organization begins to socialize them, or the American Institute of Architects or others, and spread them through networks, they spread much more rapidly and much more deeply because people aren't just learning them, they're collaborating about them. So for your sustainability plan, it's really important to identify not only who are those obvious networks that I just named, but who are some of the less obvious community groups and social networks for spreading them. And then environmental and physical wealth. And what happens is when you break these into a lot of indicators, you get, so this is Santa Monica, a sustainability index that they have done. So has Washington set a list of indicators of sustainability? Yes, okay, great. And so having them and tracking them and reporting on them really help. And what I'm encouraging is, and do they, I should know this, but do they go beyond just the environmental and also call the social and the economic? Okay, great. So that's really, really key. The essential element for healthy urban systems is infrastructure. So one of the things that makes Washington such a fantastic city is its mass transit system. It could not be the city it is without the mass. Everything in many ways flows from that. So I break systems down, I'm going to talk a little more about this in detail, into hard systems and soft systems, active and passive, complex, complicated, or simple, central and distributed, and human and natural. So for example, central and distributed. Typically, the United States, our power systems are all centralized. We have one central utility. Our power may come from 3 or 4 power plants around a city, but it's a centralized system. What we're learning is that resilient systems mix those with distributed, so having green building systems, so having solar power on our individual buildings makes the whole system much more resilient. In fact, one of the things that is not being done that I've begun to do in our buildings is having a combination of solar, batteries, and gas-fired generators. Because what it means is when power goes out, which is more and more likely due to more and more extreme weather events, when the power goes out, your solar is really not useful at night, and often solar has to be disconnected. But if the solar is feeding a battery system, then you can get 5 or 6 hours, maybe even 8, out of the battery system. When the battery system goes down, you can run the generator. But instead of the generators running 24 hours a day, which puts a lot of pollution into the air, the generators can run 3 or 4 hours a day, charge the batteries back up, the solar system can charge the battery back up, and you have much, much less generator use, and yet total reliability. So we need to think about combining, that's just an energy example, but in all systems in combining central and distributed. I'll show you later, but for example, your roof detention, stormwater detention system is a form of a distributed utility really on buildings. So hard systems are these physical systems like your subway systems. The soft systems are the operating systems. And what we've learned is the way we operate the systems, and in fact the behavioral choices that the operators make are as critical as the hard systems. So for example, in a mass transit system, if the subway only comes once every hour, people use it a lot less than it has a 10 or 15 minute headway. We've learned, I mean, Washington was really one of the maybe the first place that did nextbus.com, where all of a sudden you combine a soft system where people could see when the next bus was coming, and it increased ridership and it made it much more friendly for people. So we should be thinking about how we integrate those two. The active systems and the passive systems. So active systems have motors and generators, and they have things that push them. Passive systems are, for example, the New York City water supply system, which is entirely gravity fed. I'll show you some more examples of these. So this is the new San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, and it was designed to fail. So this is another important principle. The bridge came down in an earthquake a decade ago or so, and this new bridge is designed, it has flexibility built in. There are key parts that when they're under torque, they fail. And so the bridge doesn't fall down, it just kind of slumps a little bit, and those parts are stored in the base of the bridge, and it's all designed so they can be replaced. These are like shock absorbers, essentially. Instead of designing the super duper shock absorber that can absorb any shock, they design one that after a certain amount of shock fails, but fails in a way that absorbs shock. And then they have spare parts, and within 4 hours you can put the new ones in, and the bridge is back working again. So our strategy used to be a rigid one. We're going to resist stress by super duper resilient, rigidity. And now we're thinking about it tempering. So when you temper steel, you make it less brittle and more flexible. And so we need to be thinking about that in all our systems, but particularly our infrastructure systems, because our infrastructure systems are going to increasingly not only have stress in some places of the country from earthquakes or from hurricanes and storms, but from heat waves. By the way, we're going to have population surge stresses. So we need to design them to be much more resilient. Another example of the combination of hard systems and soft systems. This is an image that was developed by the Museum of Modern Art, actually, for an exhibit called Rising Tides that looked at what are the effect of climate change on New York City. And what we realized is the best defense is not necessarily big seawalls. There may be some seawalls over the long run, but actually building oyster beds that flowed out from the city. The oysters have this fantastic, typical oyster can purify 30 to 50 gallons of water a day. So it's a great water cleansing system, but also, and it creates these wetlands are actually very beautiful. I actually think they create real estate value. But thinking of the edge where the water meets our cities as a soft edge and greening it, we now know dramatically increases its ability to absorb storm water, creates parks when there's not a storm or something like that. And so it's a key part of the resilience. So remember I mentioned earlier that when we look at our cities from above, we see a lot of concrete and not that much green space. The reinsertion of the green space into our cities has many multiple co-benefits. As a matter of fact, it's probably the most cost-effective thing we can do, because it not only absorbs air pollution, it increases real estate value, which by the way means it's increasing taxes nearby. It's absorbing stormwater. It's providing shade. It's actually typically in areas that are treed during the summer will have 6 degrees lower temperature than areas that are not treed. And many, by the way, it encourages people to walk. An interesting study shows that when people run outside on a city street or run through a park-like area, they actually have more health benefits. Their heart rates are lower through running through the green areas. I talked about the operating systems. This is the operating system in Rio. What we're beginning to see is the ability to integrate systems. So I'm going to run this theme of tempering a bit. So I mentioned to you earlier that when we temper steel, we make it more flexible. There's an idea called musical temperament. It turns out that before about 1650, every scale was tuned differently. A, B, C, D, every musical scale, and you couldn't switch from one to another. Temperament is a system that actually redesigned the space between the notes just a little bit so you could switch, and it allowed people like Bach to create this amazing music because the scales became interoperable. So what we found, I'll give you a New York example, we found when we tried to combine systems that they were not interoperable. So for example, New York City tried to do a whole building code search to create algorithms which could identify where there were most likely to be fire safety violations. It was a public safety effort. And what they found is the fire department was coding all building addresses by something called call boxes, which used to be those things out on the street. That the police department was using a physical address, that the building department was using a building block and lot number, the tax department was using tax number, the water department had a water meter number, and when you got down to it, there were 11 different ways of identifying a building. So you could never integrate all those systems because they didn't talk to each other. So the key to having smart systems that can really increase the efficiency of cities, number one, is having them all speak the same language. Number two, really important, is as we start looking at big data and using it to create more efficient systems, it has a huge chance of leaving out people, of actually leaving out our residents and consumers, particularly low-income residents, because they're not going to have access necessarily to these systems or the training on how to understand the algorithms or understand what the information is coming out. So there's an enormous risk that whereas on one hand, these big data systems can make our city's infrastructure function much more effectively, if we do not think about how to also integrate social equity into it, it'll be another digital divide. Another hard system. So the Blue Plains wastewater treatment plant, one of yours, is actually one of the greenest in the country. It's really an incredible new model. Really kudos to the city for this plant. And we need to be thinking more and more about, and by the way, this is a plant that is not only processing waste, but then recycling the sludge, capturing the methane that comes across it, has some of the most advanced biological treatment systems in the country. So Washington has long been a leader on infrastructure, and that's a very key part of a sustainability plan. This is a passive house. I said strategy should be active. So for example, water treatment plants, et cetera, those are active systems. Passive house and passive systems, how many people have heard the phrase passive house? Okay, so a lot of you, but not all of you. A passive house is one that uses 80% less energy than a normal building, and it uses 80% less because it's using the walls are so well insulated, it doesn't really need heat, and they reject summer heat in the summer. It's got natural shading. They say some of these houses are so efficient you can heat them with light bulbs. The amazing passive houses have within them an idea of passive resilience. So again, when the power goes out, when the heat wave happens, a passive building, so for example, when there's a brownout, even if the power doesn't go out, but air conditioning use goes down, that's very life-threatening to low-income seniors, and seniors in general, but low-income seniors who can't afford to pay peak electric rates. So passive buildings are really essential part of the system. They increase the overall resilience of the system. They take stress off the demands on the energy needs of the system and the water use of the system. There are very few passive multifamily buildings. And as you think about your next generation of codes, et cetera, I would think about rewarding. They're more expensive to build, but I think they're a critical part of the infrastructure of cities moving forward. This is a project called David and Joyce Dinkins Gardens, the first green affordable housing project in Harlem, which we built. And this is the rainwater capture system. It's kind of ugly, but it's really important, is capturing rainwater. So one of the ways we can reduce our demand on water is in the suburbs, over 50% of water is used, of fresh water is used for irrigation. It's a lower percentage in cities, but the more we can use rainwater for just laundry and green roofs, et cetera, the better. And I mentioned already the idea of solar. In urban settings, it's very hard to have enough solar to provide solar for all of the units, but we can definitely provide enough solar for the basic core and shell, for running the elevators, keeping the heat on when it's freezing, and minimal corridor and emergency lighting. Open space. So I mentioned earlier how critical open space is, particularly at the water's edge. This is the new Brooklyn Bridge Park, a whole park system that's been built along, that literally 10 years ago just did not exist in New York City. The waterfront are really important areas to be capturing. And when you build these parks, as I said earlier, they create enormous real estate value. They also create well-being value in the residents. Remember earlier when I talked about measurements, I said driving towards an ultimate measurement of the human and natural system's well-being. So this is a critical element to this. There's another new park that's being built in New York City and being built in Governor's Island. Governor's Island is flat, but if you look at this, you see hills. One of the strategies that was used in this was actually to take demolition waste and of other buildings on Governor's Island and pile it up and create diversity in the topography, which creates kind of more magic and mystery, adds to the exercise value. And here's another park in New York City, you know, the High Line, which was just inserted in an old abandoned rail line. We're seeing this happen all over the place. And so parks don't have to be these large agglomerations. They can be these really strategic inserts into the fabric of a community, which helps encourage walking, encourage people to connect in another way. This is actually in Guangzhou. It's under a highway. And this happens much in America, where we put our highways, when they decided to put highways, the only open space that was kind of long and linear were rivers. So they buried the rivers and put the highways over them. In this case, they then brought back the river and turned the whole area under it into a park, painted the underside of the highway white, and it's actually a very beautiful park system now. Green streets, I know that that's part of your code, and it's one of the things that you're beginning to focus on. Green streets create enormous environmental value, increase the value of the neighborhood, absorb stormwater, et cetera. And as the climate changes, we need to find more and more ways of absorbing stormwater. This is inside the EPA building, so we're going to be doing our roofs. We're going to be doing inside buildings, on the outside of buildings, on the facades of buildings. I wanted to give you a perspective of where Washington ranks, and by the way, this is the Economist Magazine Intelligence Unit. It does not mean that it's right. Every Green City Index picks different standards. The overall rating, Washington was rated in 2011 as number 8. But on buildings, I mean, I understand that Washington has the largest number of LEED green certified buildings in the country. On buildings, you see Washington ranks number 3, and on governance, number 1. And that's really important. We believe that everything flows from governance. That when you get the governance right, and it's really the leadership, and then connect governance with community-based networks, and so it's a top-down, middle-up, middle-out. So it's working. Remember, I mentioned earlier the Urban Land Institute, the U.S. Green Building Council, the AIA, all those good guy networks, the community-based networks, the community development organizations, groups like Enterprise Community Partners. When you weave all those together into your green governance strategy. And then, of course, the key departments in the city. That's really where I think all the other results flow from. Great new sustainability plan, very much to be applauded, and the idea that DC would be more socially equitable, environmentally responsible, and economically prosperous. The idea of tying those three together and not just saying it's about the environment is critical. As I mentioned earlier, it's very hard to have environmental equity without social equity. Your green area ratio is extremely innovative. I believe it's the only city in the country to do it. Pardon me? Seattle has it too? Okay. But is yours better? Stormwater retention requirements. I'm actually going to show you a project. So you're asking people to retain 1.2 inches for new construction. Philadelphia actually requires 3. I'm going to show you a project. Let's go on to that. So this is the project actually in Philadelphia. It's called Paseo Verde. It is literally touching in North Philly, the North Philly train station, a block away from a existing public housing project, and which we hope will become a choice community project, and several blocks away from Temple University. This is in a neighborhood that was in desperate conditions. Really, really bad conditions, and has been revitalized by a local community development organization called APM, Puerto Rican-based group, and we know how important community development organizations are for the revitalization of our community. This is mixed income, LEED Platinum, so it's half low-income housing tax credit, half new market tax credit. I mentioned how important health is for the revitalization of communities. Has a 30,000 square foot health clinic and social services provided, along with a pharmacy and a bank in the base of the building. Here's some of the green strategies. The one I really want to focus on is capturing the rainwater, and we capture the rainwater in 3 ways. This is a construction photo. By the way, the building is now just completed and will be featured if anybody goes to the USGBC meeting in Philadelphia, you can see it. But so here's the green roof. There, as you saw from the design of the building, it's a series of bars with green roofs spread out in between, so all the residents are look in and have access to these green spaces. And then this is the number one strategy for where we detain water is on the roof. But then number two, we put it into absorption pits underneath the building that are designed. So there's a whole process. The water is being detained and then trickled down and refiltered back into the earth. Okay, I want to talk about some of the things that we did in New York City. About a year ago, passed what was called the Zone Green Text Amendment, which did the following. It allowed for a developer to add more exterior insulation to his building without losing floor area. I gave a green speech in Hong Kong, and the buildings there have the skinniest glass facade. The real estate they don't rent buildings there. Almost everything's sold. And it sells for such extraordinary prices that the value of every additional inch is so worth it that they completely don't insulate their buildings. They make them as skinny as possible, and that's why you see these all glass facades, because glass is really skinny. So it's a horrible environmental strategy. So if you give developers the extra floor area for insulation and say that's free, we don't count it, that's very, very helpful. So the second thing is we allowed sun control devices. We allowed sunshades to project over the street without an additional permit. We allowed, so then we have a maximum height. It's not as uniform as it is in Washington, but in different districts. And what we said is solar installations could project above the height. Rooftop greenhouses could project above the height. Windmills could project above the height. And so that actually encourages those rooftop uses. And then promoting electric vehicle charging stations and solar generation uses, which we described. Hurricane Sandy hit soon thereafter, and the Urban Green Council, which is the local chapter of the USGBC, then really began to look at what are things that we can add to our buildings inexpensively that increase their resilience in times of disaster. So for example, common area faucets, so that, our water pressure takes water up to about the 6th floor. If you live above that, you're out of luck. So what if there's a common area shower and some faucets, inexpensive, that people can access in times of stress? Operable windows, of course, are key. Cogeneration system, I described earlier, the combination of a battery system with a solar system and gas, and how efficient that can be. Insulating walls, again, moving more and more towards the passive housing. Salt-tolerant trees in areas near the oceanfront. This is actually, so what happens when you design building for sea level rise, they can be very brutal, because if you think the sea level is going to be up 6 feet by 2080, and you think you're building a building that's to be around by 2080, then what do you do? One of the strategies is you put garages on the ground floor and say by then we won't need cars. And the garages, though, have kind of ugly walls. So this is a proposal we did for a project in 100 Point South. And if you look to the right of the image, you'll see people on a rooftop terrace. This is, by the way, a courtyard for the building, so the building kind of wraps around this. And if you look to the far left, you'll see people sitting around tables outside. So the left is the street level, and the right side is actually 8 feet higher as the courtyard level. And what we have is a series of step-ups. So in fact, there's in effect a water wall embedded in the system, but you don't see the water wall because of these terrace gardens. Terracing both slows down the slosh of water, but it also provides green space and helps green the city. We think you need to really think about future water height elevations, where they will be, where you think your buildings need to be, and then the most environmentally and urbanistically responsible ways of getting to those elevations. I mentioned earlier having scorecards that really measure your own sustainability metrics. It's also important to have scorecards that measure your building's metrics. And many cities now we're beginning to see are requiring that these scorecards be made public. I was giving a talk in Charlotte, and they have a system where downtown everybody's contributing to like an overall scorecard. And I said, and of course, this information is going to be made public. And they said, oh, absolutely not. And I said, why not? And they said, because if buildings are rated on 1 to 100, and everybody's aiming for an Energy Star rating of 75 or better, not everybody can get there. So those of us who are participating, we know that 75% of us are going to be below 75. And some of us are going to be 50, and some of us are going to be 25, and one of us is going to be the worst. And we don't want our boss to know that. So if we made it public, it would look lousy for more of us and it'd make us look good. So we're not making it public. The individual ratings, we're showing the aggregate ratings. I don't think that's a helpful strategy for measurement or for moving a city forward. What was really interesting about this scorecard, by the way, which we use on all our buildings, it's created by Bright Power, is you'll see that we got an A overall, but we got a D on the cooling index and the non-seasonal electric index. And this is a LEED Gold building. That was very helpful for us. What we discovered is we have a heat pump system, and we have pumps that are continually running, and that's what was running up that cost, that run the central loop. And so what this told us was it was actually very cost effective even for us to change that pump with a variable speed pump that actually was demand driven rather than just continuously driven. I'm going to end by showing you a building called Villa Verde. It's a building we completed 2 years ago in the South Bronx. And this is very important. This is the design is important. The building has won many, many awards, both national and global, for design excellence. In an area of a city that people did not think of as a prime area for design excellence and global leadership in the environment, the South Bronx. This building cost 7% more to make it this beautiful green building than a normal affordable housing building in New York City. And I understand that if we took our affordable housing budgets and spent 7% more across the board, we would build 7% fewer affordable housing units. And the affordable housing crisis is so extraordinary, we need every bit of funding for affordable housing we can. But I also believe that if we built buildings like this, let me show you a little bit more about this. But if we build buildings like this, say 1 out of every 10 or 1 out of every 20, it's a very minor addition to the overall affordable housing budget. And yet it is incredibly neighborhood transforming. This building is a mix of low-income housing and low-income rental and middle-income co-ops. I mentioned all the passive strategies. It has a pre-manufactured, highly insulated facade, those metal panels, and then these sun screens, which you can see how they screen out the summer sun from the windows, but also improve the aesthetics. Has this beautiful interior courtyard. With an amphitheater. It has a whole progression from public to the private realm. Above the amphitheater, you actually children's play area, the amphitheater. Above that are these beautiful gardens. To the right, there's orchards that grow food. The gardens, there's not enough gardens for everybody in the building, so we run them collectively, and everybody actually, it's like a big CSA, and everybody's growing green organic food for the whole community that's then distributed to the whole community. All the gardens are watered by the rainwater that's captured. If you keep going up to the left, as you keep going up these different levels of the building, you'll see there's a beautiful outdoor exercise area, reading area, and a meditation area that's connected to the gym. Often in affordable housing, the exercise room is put in the basement. Here we put it up in the light and the air and gave it a beautiful outdoor roof. This is the orchard. The units are designed, remember I talked about passive resilience? So the units are designed as duplexes so that they can naturally ventilate, so the air can come in on one level, go upstairs and out the other. So here's the living room. This is of a typical unit. New development strategy. It's really important to have a baseline of what's acceptable, and I really believe that we should identify key areas where you compete for design excellence, and what we found is that has a ripple effect. It has a ripple effect through the development community, understanding what new and more could be possible, and it has a ripple effect through the neighborhood itself, because the people who live in this neighborhood are extremely proud of being in the Villa Verde neighborhood and being near an award-winning building. This is a building that we renovated as a green retrofit in Seattle called the Vance Building. So America builds less than 1% of its building stock a year new. So if we're really going to have environmental impact, we have to affect our existing building stock. And what we have found is that when we green our existing buildings, the payoff is not just in the energy and water savings, but it's in the increased stickiness of the occupancy. That our occupants really fall in love with, they love being in a green building, and they're less likely to leave. So when the recession happened, our buildings outperformed because we were not paying for vacancy and turnover cost. So I think with that, I'm going to end. And okay.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. What we're going to do is take some questions for Mr. Rose after the mayor speaks. The mayor just arrived. I was asked to introduce the mayor, which I've done on many occasions, and I always thought it was a very easy task because I remember when I was in law school, we had Justice Thurgood Marshall speak to our class, and one of the deans introduced Thurgood Marshall, and he said, if I spent any time introducing somebody that you already know and you're intimately familiar with, it would rise to the level of hyperbole and folly. And that's, God, I got to write those words down. But I'm going to spend a little time talking about some of his accomplishments, especially as they relate to green, because and one of the words that Mr. Rose mentioned was governance, and that says it all. That's another term that just says it all. He is a true, he's actually the role of a governor. And as soon as we become a state, he'll probably be elected as the governor. So pretty soon we'll be the state of New Columbia and Governor Vincent C. Gray. But he is a true governor. He has taken the lead. He established our sustainability implementation plan. He established a green cabinet, of which I'm a part, and Harriet is a part, and our director, Michael Kelly from the Department of Housing and Community Development, and a lot of other cabinet level officials, and we meet regularly, and the mayor keeps up with it. One thing about this mayor, a lot of mayors are figureheads. You know, they're there and they kiss the babies and they go out and do ribbon cuttings, but this mayor is hands-on. And he makes sure that things like our green sustainability plan and so forth are implemented. And so it's not just a term, it's really something that we have to do. But for those of you who live far, far away and don't know Vincent C. Gray, he is a native Washingtonian, and he became a council member and then was elected as a chairman of the city council. And then in 2011, he was sworn in as the mayor of the District of Columbia, garnering nearly 75% of the vote. And you know, when I was preparing, I said, well, let me tell the folks something about the mayor. Maybe they might not know that much about him. So I did some Google, and I looked at Wikipedia. And there were 4 pages in Wikipedia. I said, that's too much. Google was just, you know, it just pages and pages of the mayor. So I would spend a long time if I went through all the his accomplishments. But he has certainly dedicated his life to public service, and he's always worked tirelessly for the citizens, the residents, the visitors, and guests of the District of Columbia. When he became mayor, he pledged to, and for those of you who don't know, we also have this gradeDC.gov concept where 15 agencies are rated, and that's the result of the mayor. And a lot of people were skeptical about that program, but it's worked tremendously well because we're now competing among agencies to get the highest grade. DCRA started with a C-, and for the month of July, we were A+. And it's because we're competing, even among the staff, they're competing to get the most compliments from this initiative. So it sounded like it might not work and people were skeptical, but it's worked tremendously. And it was because the mayor had the vision for this program. So I'm going to grade him now because he's graded us, he's going to be graded. So one of his pledges was to help unite the district by focusing on job creation and economic development. He gets an A. to collaborate, to establish a collaborative approach to school reform, and he gets an A. And you all probably saw the latest resort test scores where DC is as high as it's ever been. He pledged safer streets in all neighborhoods, and he gets an A for that. And he's pledged to restore fiscal responsibility to city government, and he gets an A for that. And he also established the first green cabinet, as I mentioned, and sustainable DC implementation plan, and he gets an A for that. This is our second year, and this is DCRA's way in part, of implementing his plan. And you've heard about some of the other achievements the DCRA's had, but it's all due to our mayor. And one thing that he pledged was, and this is the final thing, that our children and grandchildren would have the same or better quality of life than we enjoy today. And that's why we're here today, and I think he gets an A for that. So ladies and gentlemen, present to some of you, probably present to most of you, and introduce to others, the Honorable Vincent C. Gray.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. I think that was a 4.0, wasn't it? I don't know, maybe Nick is an easy grader. But I really appreciate that introduction very much, and I'm delighted to be here with you all this afternoon. I see some of our other colleagues, who are working hard. I see Harriet Tregonning, who's been working diligently on the planning issues in the city, and especially most recently on the building height issue. That will be a challenge for us, and I'm sure this group will have some opinions on that as well. Michael Kelly, who has responsibility for housing and community development, an enormously important area of this city. One of the tougher jobs in government, and I was so glad when Michael made the decision to come back to the District of Columbia. He kind of got away from us and went to New York, and then he went to Philadelphia, and I saw the trend. He's coming south again, and we're glad he's back in the District of Columbia. And I see Brendan there as well. Brendan has done such great work with us working on our sustainable DC plan. I'll talk a little bit about that today, and I'm very excited about that. It is, by the way, exciting to think of the day, and the day will come when we are not any longer the District of Columbia, that we are New Columbia. And boy, won't it be fantastic to be treated like a real citizen of the United States of America. I made some comments last week and again today. I do things that are a little provocative at times, and I was even greeted by the press outside. They want to talk about the government shutdown, the federal shutdown, and what I think about that. And what I think about it is absolutely unconscionable that the people of the District of Columbia would be subjected to a federal shutdown. We're not a federal agency. We're not the Department of Health and Human Services. We're not the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Defense or the Department of Veterans Affairs. We are a place that is home to 632,000 people. We raise our own money, ladies and gentlemen. We have income taxes, we have property taxes, we have sales taxes. We generate $6.1 billion a year that then is part of us making decisions in the same way that states make those decisions. A budget is put together. The legislative body debates that budget, makes whatever changes it is, and eventually you have a budget that is adopted. And we have the money available to us to be able to run this government on October 1st. So why would we be shut down? And I don't think we should be shut down, ladies and gentlemen. You know, and people have asked me, am I prepared to be defiant? Am I prepared to? Well, I went to jail once, for, it was a budget battle. It was a budget battle that we were involved in. And I got upset, like a lot of other people did, when somebody said, we'll give you the District of Columbia as a part of a deal. Hell, I'm not part of a bartering system where you can trade me, for some other goods or services that may be on the table. And I didn't even want to talk about this today. I'm all up on this now. But I I have gotten to the point, where I raise the question with people. We go so many places where you dutifully raise your hand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and people do it without even thinking anymore. And there's a phrase in there that says, with liberty and justice for all. I find it hard to say that now. I find it hard not to say with liberty and justice for all unless you live in the District of Columbia. Because frankly, that is exactly the way we are treated, ladies and gentlemen. And I don't think we have to make any excuses for who we are, because I think we do as well as the rest. I go to these national meetings, and I know what we're doing and what we're not doing in the District of Columbia. And frankly, there are lots of people now who are looking to the District of Columbia for what it is that we are doing. And what we are doing in terms of the environment, what we're doing in terms of sustainability, and what we're doing in terms of green buildings, I think is a part of what people are looking at. So now that I've got my political statement out, I hope that you all will be as outraged as I am about how the city is dealt with in such second-class ways. Nick mentioned it, as many of you know, one of the major initiatives of our administration over the past 2 years, and I guess we've been in office now 2 years and eight and a half months or something like that, has been Sustainable DC. How many of you are familiar with Sustainable DC? How many of you are not familiar with it? How many of you couldn't care less? Well, I think you need to get familiar with it because it has 143 initiatives, 104 of which I understand are in performance plans. I was talking to Keith Anderson the other day, are in performance plans for the next fiscal year. And 64 of which already progress having been made, which is roughly half of what we set out. We said we'd do this in 20 years, and in 20 years I want us to be the healthiest, I want us to be the greenest, and I want us to be the most livable city, one day to become a state in the United States of America. My own vision is that the district will be a model of innovative policies and practices that improve the quality of life as well as economic opportunities for our residents. I think by working together, the government, private sector, residents, people all across the city, we will actually be able to demonstrate how enhancing our natural and built environments, investing in a diverse and clean economy, how we then will be able to reduce disparities among residents and how that can create and educate and create an educated and equitable and prosperous society here in the District of Columbia. All of those are nice words, aren't they? But it really means paying attention to the things that if we don't pay attention to them, we will cease to exist at some point because we will have killed ourselves. Some of this probably sounds like an impossible dream, but again, let me assure you that the leadership that people like those that I just mentioned, as well as Deputy Mayor Victor Hoskins and others, Keith Anderson across the city, it really is eminently doable for us to achieve this. And frankly, if we believe it, I think we can achieve it, to use a phrase. And that's why I'm really excited about the focus of this year's Green Building Symposium, and that is looking at the 2013 construction codes, the green area ratio and green infrastructure. Kind of hard to get excited about construction codes, isn't it? How many people are just wildly excited about the construction codes? I should have known in this crowd that there would be wild enthusiasm about that, and that's great. Of course, an absolutely huge part of the Sustainable DC effort is green building practices. In order to leave our children and grandchildren with a better environment, we need to make sure what we're building is done in an environmentally sound manner that ensures long-term sustainability. How many people have taken a look at their electric bill recently? I took a look at mine. I was glad that the summer was over, you know, because of the air conditioning issues associated with it. How about your water bill? How many people look at their water bill? You know, I hear from a lot of folks who talk about having looked at those utility bills and are absolutely staggered by the result of that experience. And I think we all know in this room especially that it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. My goal is that one day in the near future that we won't be in a state of shock when we open these bills, because our home, our offices will be built to use minimal amounts of water and minimal amounts of energy, and actually will result in the saving of money. Do we think that's possible, ladies and gentlemen? How many of you all think that's possible? And frankly, instead of being simply a user of electricity, wouldn't it be great to have rooftop solar panels that are providing the energy that we use, having them produce the energy for the structures that they are a part of, and maybe even send some electricity, some energy back to the electrical grid. Can you imagine that? We actually are producing that. We've got a net positive on the energy that's being produced. And of course, that would obviously recycle it. We hope would be available for others to use, and would begin to get increasingly large numbers of people thinking about sustainability. You know, I had an interesting experience not so long ago where I was going on about sustainability and, you know, talking about what we were doing. I was talking to a policymaker, and the person looked at me and said, "What is sustainability?" I said, "Boy, you know, you take certain things for granted when you shouldn't." And frankly, it is a term that is not all that common. And I'm not sure that lots of people, perhaps, you know, outside of a room like this, can explain what sustainability is. And I think one of the jobs we have, if we want to make this commonplace, is to be able to get people to really understand the fundamentals of what it is that we're talking about. To achieve the goals that fulfills our vision for sustainability, I think it will be essential to advance our construction codes. I'm sure that everybody in this room probably agrees with that. And that's why we've dedicated the administration, that's why we've got so many dedicated volunteers from the private sector who have worked diligently over the past year to develop the most modern building codes to promote green buildings in the district. I'm not sure that we don't have the most contemporary and forward-thinking construction building codes now in the nation. And if you don't know any differently than that, then we're just going to claim it, okay? We now have the most forward-thinking, contemporary building codes in the nation. I'm sure many of you remember when green construction first appeared on the scene. It was actually as viewed as something novel, something different, and appealed only to boutique, you know, type developers, as opposed to being looked at as something that was commonplace. Well, don't you think that we have passed the state of being a fad? And it was not passing, was it? I think the number of people in this room and what you do every day is a prima facie case for why it wasn't a fad and wasn't something that simply passed on. We've had a major impact now on an increasingly large number of homeowners, on residents, and even on tenants who may not own the buildings, but they're increasingly taking cognizance of what it means to be in a green building and to be in a sustainable environment. Because of the Green Building Act, our newly built and renovated district government buildings are setting an example for green building by being built to LEED Silver, Gold, and sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, even platinum levels now in the District of Columbia. We created a department when I first came into office. In fact, on October 1st, it will have its second anniversary, the Department of General Services. How many of you all are aware of DGS? Headed by Brian Hanlon, who by training is an architect, and who pays lots of attention to these kinds of issues. And you want to have a great conversation, sit down with Brian at times and let him tell you about the energy-saving efforts that are being effectuated across the government. They have a sustainability division within DGS now that is focusing on how we increasingly make more economical our energy use in the government. Affordable housing. Housing is going to be in part affordable because of the energy-saving techniques that we introduce. We just in this budget, some of you may know this, we just included in the budget that supposedly starts on October 1st, the largest single investment in affordable housing or almost anything in the government of a new effort in the history of this government. We are investing, starting October 1st, $100 million into affordable housing. And a part of making housing affordable, obviously, is making it sustainable and making it energy efficient and hopefully meeting LEED certified standards. Frankly, one of the ways in which we have moved forward, and I guess Harriet and I were talking about this some time ago, and that is our private sector really has stepped up and taken the lead. They really are blazing the way forward with state-of-the-art buildings that inspire the nation. How many of you all have seen the PNC building on 17th Street? Isn't it phenomenal? And if you haven't, go see it, because when you go in there, they have like a concierge desk, and they hand you a brochure. And it's not a brochure about PNC. It's a brochure about the building and why it is so contemporary and why it is such a model for sustainability. So I think we're getting rid of the idea of a green building altogether, because what we're doing is making what's been called a green building a part of the standard building process, certainly in the District of Columbia, and that is the direction that we should be pursuing. Our proposed 2013 DC construction codes, which public employees and private sector volunteers and others have been working diligently on, have now codified, and you know this, they've codified green building practices, best practices from around the city, and have made it a standard for the future. I think the people in this room one day, you will be looked back on as pioneers, as people who really made a difference in how we improve the quality of life in a city to become more sustainable. These new codes, for the first time, include a green construction code. And it also includes a strong and thoughtful energy conservation code. How many people have paid attention to the Energy Conservation Code? Goes back to starting by paying attention to your utility bills, which is a good way to be sobered up. But that's just the beginning. We're not done yet. Over the past year, the district has worked hard to adopt the new green area ratio zoning regulations, which will reduce stormwater runoff into our rivers. Actually, stormwater runoff is one of the principal reasons why our rivers are polluted in the first place. The Anacostia River, which, anybody know what the percentage of the Anacostia River is actually in the District of Columbia? Anybody know? How much? You don't count. You're a ringer. It is actually 18%. 82% of the Anacostia River is outside the District of Columbia and in another jurisdiction, which means that if we don't work effectively together, we won't achieve the outcomes. And it's one of the reasons why our rivers remain polluted, and that is stormwater runoff into both the Potomac as well as the Anacostia River. We're working to improve air quality and to combat the effects of urban heat, as well as the effect of landscape features such as green roofs. How many people here have a green roof? I guess we got a ways to go on that one, huh? A lot of our buildings now are being built with green roofs. Of course, the Department of the Environment should be in a building that has a green roof, right? But I was over there not so long ago and up on the roof, and checking out the green roof over there. And all of our office buildings in the future should be built in the same way. And we've got even more that is going on. We've adopted new stormwater regulations for the city, across the city, which will actually ensure that we clean up our rivers. With the construction codes and green regulations as the baseline for development, our next challenge will be to find ways to encourage builders to aspire to build far beyond the minimum requirements. And do we think that's possible? I do too. I actually do. I think people are starting to get it. And I think they recognize that, frankly, whatever they build will be far more marketable from a business perspective. And I think they recognize too that the effects, the social, if you will, effects of creating a more sustainable building will be far more appealing to people as we go forward. So we've got a chance, I think, to really push the frontiers of sustainability. This plan that we adopted, Harriet? We started this journey in July of 2011 with you and me and one other person in the room. We then had a website that was launched in September of 2011. And then we decided to have this meeting, and some of you may have been there. We decided to have this meeting at the convention center in November of 2011. We thought if we were lucky, maybe 50 or 75 people would show up. And for those of you who were there, you know, there were 450 people who showed up, which certainly made the case for a commitment to doing this. We then developed a vision plan, which was released in April on Earth Day of 2012. And then we took almost another year to do the sustainability plan, which was actually released earlier this year. So we have spent 2 years doing something that I think will serve the city well into the future. And there are many people in this room who will be able to look back on these last 2 years and recognize what an enormous contribution you have made to moving the city forward. What we see right now is a city that is growing, and is thriving, it is vibrant, it is energized. We are growing at the rate of 1,100 or 1,200 people a month. Our population is now 632,000. I actually think it's probably closer to 645,000 people, because the data from which the 632 were drawn goes back almost a year. We have a population that now is larger than the state of Wyoming. We have a population that is larger than the state of Vermont, and we have the challenges that are associated with having a relatively small jurisdiction geographically, and what is associated with that. At the rate we are growing, by the year 2032, we could be between 850 and 900,000 people living in the District of Columbia. And so what we are doing right now will determine whether people continue to feel that this is a place that they want to live. This is a place that they want to be. I don't want to, what was the word, hyperbole? I don't want to engage in hyperbole, but I don't think there's any way to exaggerate the importance of what you're doing with the construction codes and what we are doing with sustainability. Because you will be able to look back one day and say, I had a huge impact in putting an imprint on this city that will be absolutely lasting. The important thing, frankly, is to be able to say it's not an imprint of being one of the biggest, carbon users, in the nation, and creating one of the most disgusting environments in the nation, but you will have put an imprint that people will say, this is the most sustainable city in the nation. And maybe by that time, we also will be able to say it is the most sustainable state in the United States of America. Thank you all very much.